All right.
And we're back.
We're back, yes.
With the plug in the phone. And as I was saying, I think that Jim is not, as he said to me when I was putting together this opening paragraph, I think Jim is being sincere when he says they used almost everything. The rough outline of everything that actually probably even the somewhat detailed outline of everything that happens in this story Bible does appear in the novels, with changes, of course.
Changes in one way or another.
One way or another, right?
Pretty much.
And it's kind of funny as you're reading through and looking at his marginalia. He has there'll be a paragraph and he says "why," and then there'll be another paragraph where he just says "X," and then another paragraph where he just says "no," and so that's interesting. So I guess before we proceed, I'd like to say that I have had the opportunity to read this from front to back just once in the time since I got it, and that was in the week preparing for coming to this con. And I didn't pay that much attention to Jim's marginalia. I was kind of aware of them, but I was really focused on reading the story that Carl was presenting, and I would like to read that a couple more times and really get that understood, and then I'm going to go in with a much more attuned reading to Jim's marginalia, and I imagine that might be an opportunity for us to get together again and do a part 2 of this video.
Yeah, if we can get through part 1.
Get to part 1. Yeah. We're plugged in, so we're not going to run out of power.
Yeah, but we are long-winded at times.
Yes. And it's getting late, so that's a hard out for us when I pass out.
But so there it is kind of. Admittedly, it's sort of amusing, like when we get to certain bits of the marginalia in which, he goes, "No!" exclamation point or something. It's like a pretty strong reaction to something here, and like with Karen Penn, after I had a chance to go through initially some time ago, my first impressions with what he did. I did mention that you worked on making Karen less, certainly less unsavory, or not even unsavory, because I feel like in the story Bible that she does come off pretty unsavory, and she fights other female officers due to being upset over her promotion, and gets thrown in the brig, and then Jim notes that it makes her too much like Dana.
Yeah, that's a good point. And
it's like,
it's recapitulating Dana's story.
Right.
And I think that's interesting.
Because Karen Penn, certainly, look, I feel like she's definitely like a strong-minded character. Even it's established for the Sentinels video, and that carries through the novels. That she's a pretty stable kind of character, intelligent, and Baker's the one who's it's pretty reckless, the hothead,
and he remains reckless through the this.
And it's also what's interesting about Karen is like, there's some kind of triangle going on with Nea and Jack and Karen, because look, it's Karen and Jack. They're very much a situation comedy romance going on, which is not unknown in Robotech, right?
Right,
but Nea thrown into this, and she sort of like challenges Nea, and thankfully, Jim and Brian didn't have had her go through with any kind of challenge or have any challenge made between her and Nea, because Nea has a certain height advantage, Amazonian strength advantage, I think.
I know. Well, Nea was the younger one, so she was the smaller of the two, if I remember.
Right, smaller of the two, but still like Amazon.
Presumably.
Yeah,
but I think she was meant to be the cute one, whereas Bella was the matronly one.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting about the Jack and Karen relationship is, in light of where these characters originally come from, and there is a piece of line art, and maybe if you've got an editor, we can have it flash up with this, was that it appears to be the case that as Carl was developing the Sentinels, he was at the same time who was developing the Robotech movie from Megazone.
Right.
And that the characters we know from the Robotech movie as Mark and Becky are there's a piece of character art that shows the characters from the Sentinels, and they're in the same poses as the beauty shot of all the characters of the Sentinels you'd see later, except instead of Jack Baker, you see Mark Landry, and instead of Karen Penn, you see Becky, and I forget Becky's last name at the moment, and instead of T.R. Edwards, you see B.D. Andrews,
right.
And so it's interesting because the conception was that these characters from the Robotech movie would move on and become part of the Sentinels, and so. That's interesting to me because that doesn't feel like Mark and Becky's relationship that you see from the show, and Karen doesn't really feel like Becky at all. So there's something that's moved on, whereas Mark could conceivably turn into Jack. I mean, they're kind of an archetype, the male hothead.
Right. Also, the voice actor is the same.
Yeah,
for both
that is true. That is absolutely true.
So.
And that Janice evolved from an android version of Eve. And so we're as we're talking about sort of how Sentinels came about, none of that is directly reflected in the story Bible, but there is that concept art that predates the story Bible, and that seems to suggest that there was going to be a deeper tie-in with Robotech the movie.
Yeah, which is interesting. You're a much bigger fan of Robotech the movie than I am.
Well, I was there.
Yeah.
I was there when it premiered. I was at the premiere in Dallas in August of 1986.
Right.
Carl was sitting a few rows behind me,
right.
And I had a lovely conversation with him at Lone Star Comics the prior day, and that was when I met Macek in person at that Q&A that he threw.
And which is interesting because for me, for the longest time, the Robotech movie was a mystery. I mean, all I had was what Robotech R3 said about it, and then
and by that time Macek had soured on it quite a bit.
Right, it's soured. Yeah, soured on. It did a sort of 180, but it's like, but it hasn't really upset your attitude toward that movie. Really, and from what I've known, and for me, it's like, what the Robotech Master Ship crashes, and this is supposed to take place before the Robotech Master Saga.
Yeah, that needs to be fixed.
That's like, oh man, what? That doesn't make sense whatsoever.
No, it makes absolutely no sense, and that's why.
And then, Megazone 23 stuff gets thrown in.
But you could fix it. You could fix it with one more edit to that movie, and that's a topic for another. I guess is this a podcast now? That's a topic for another video. How you could fix the Robotech movie.
Yeah. So, but when I eventually viewed it, and it wasn't through YouTube, it was. And somehow I got a copy. Some random person who his initials are same as Justice League. Might have played a part. And so, I'm very thankful to have checked it out. But I much prefer the Master's Gambit novel, in my own personal opinion. Humble opinion over the movie. But although it was inspired by the movie, and there's an Eve entity in the novel, so it's just it really is. Well, it's part of it's part of Robotech. It's got the Robotech name, and I would have loved to have seen it been in Texas at that screening,
and we had some good swag. But let's get back to the story Bible. And I think one of the things we talked about that we wanted to address was the issue of names, of planets and
planets names, and what the Mecha that is known as the Hellcat. It's interesting because it's called Cougars in
Story Bible.
In Story Bible, a term that has not aged favorably for sci-fi.
No.
Right? So, but
they were constantly being attacked by elderly Praxian women who wanted to date Jack.
Yeah, right. They were vicious.
Vicious cougars.
Vicious cougars, and but
wow.
So, but it's interesting. I think it looks like from Jim's notes, he had a hand in
naming some of these things, or renaming some of these things,
or contributing to the naming of things, because he's got instead of cougars, he suggests Hellhounds with a question mark and Battle Cats with a question mark. Maybe not thinking or aware that Hellhound is very much associated with Ghostbusters, and Battle Cat is with He-Man, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's but still, Hellhounds became, I think, my theory. I'll stick to it until proven wrong. That is that Hellhound was the intermediate step toward the name Hellcat for this mecha, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Although I do believe Cougar does show up in some of the other licensed material at some point. I mean,
Okay.
I could be wrong. It's been a while since I looked at the RPG.
Yeah.
And here's the other thing that appears. It's page 4. It's of episode 1.
Right.
And in the marginalia, Jim writes, Tyrol is the third moon of Tyrol is third moon of Phantoma. And as you go through this book, you find everywhere the location of the Robotech Master's homeworld is listed in the list of locations at the beginning, or when they're changing scenes to where it is. It says location, the moon of Phantoma. Tyrol, as far as I can tell, never actually appears in the story Bible. Now we know the name Tyrol gets used in the OVA. So by the time that the dialogue was recorded for the Sentinels video,
Right.
It had become Tyrol. But certainly he has no particular need to call it that in here. It's always the mission is launched to the moon of Phantoma, location moon of Phantoma. And so you see that throughout here. What is interesting is also that he does have a consistent understanding of the mecha.
Yeah.
And he will cite mecha by name. It's like armored alpha fighter, which I think is his term for alpha plus beta.
Right.
He'll cite condors or Logans or hover tanks. And there's actually a line in here where I think he mentions a hover tank, and I think Jim, I have to see if I can find it, but Jim basically suggests that maybe it's a more primitive version of hover tank than you see in the Southern Cross episodes, because Jim is keenly aware of, that this is, but Jim is also changing the date on this, and we can talk a little bit about that.
Right.
So Macek is very clear, starting in the very first episode's header. He says time frame 2022, and then Jim changes this to 2020.
Right.
And you see in a number of places where Jim is chafing at Carl making things happen too early. And then you get to the point where Wolf arrives back at Earth, and he lands on Earth, which is apparently 8 square miles, and immediately runs into the 15th Squad.
Yeah.
Because of course he does. And they're like, oh no, it's 2029, and the Robotech Masters have been gone for, we defeated for a couple years.
Right.
And so, and there's this whole storyline of, oh, we forgot to set the time coordinate with our fold drive, and Louis is the one who figures that out, and I believe Louis actually in this version, Louis stays behind on Earth, and has his own laboratory where he's working on ways to defeat the Invid by the end, and he does not go with them.
Well, yeah, which is something that Jim uses for before the Invid Storm in terms of keeping Louis on Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he's not as ambitious, and that Louis and before the Invid Storm is not that ambitious in taking on or destroying the Invid or
right.
It's just there, but still, it's like that seed was planted by the story Bible to keep Louis on Earth.
And so to get back to the timeline, so you see that when they say, oh, they have this realization that at some point in the journey, either the original SDF3's fold or Jonathan Wolf's fold back, they realized that there was a time coordinate that was misset, and now and that's where Jim realizes, oh, okay, this explains why he's been chafing at no too soon for all these various things.
Yeah, right.
And that's when the 5-year fold that we purists were so critical of early on that it didn't make any sense. Well, that is a Macek introduction. He introduced that because I don't think Macek wanted this story to stretch out over many years. He wanted it to wrap up, and then also he wanted to introduce the concept of time travel. And I think at the end we should talk about what the Robotech Odyssey and what little I know about that from listening to the Robotalk podcast. Subscribe to the Robotech podcast on YouTube, and so so. But if you got some other points that you want to make, I've got a name to look up since I brought that topic up.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Yeah. I think it's pretty well known that when Macek or Carl, if we go by first names, Carl met with Jim and Brian way back when they got the gig to write the novels. There was a meeting of the minds of like influences. Dune certainly being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Dune was a big influence
because Carl is like known to be a very big fan of Dune. Protoculture is the spice of Robotech, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's clear parallels, and I think one of the things I'd always attributed previously to McKinney, but now as I read the story Bible as clearly Macek's hand, is that there are a few moments in the original series that are mystical, where something clearly supernatural or requiring grave invocation of Asimov's law that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Things happen that seem magical. And in the context of the show, and from someone who watches the show, maybe you see that as just these fleeting moments.
Right.
And one of them is Dana's hallucination, which the show even calls it a hallucinatory vision. One of them is Ariel turning into an energy being, and the Regis turning into energy beings.
Right.
And to us, these are passing moments in the what is otherwise a reasonably grounded show. But to Macek, these were everything. And this sort of mystical aspect was kind of his vision of where he wanted to go with Robotech. And maybe that actually speaks to, I think, a lot of the mismatch between the tone of what Macek's doing here and the tone of the story that was originally written by the 3 Japanese teams.
Right.
And Macek came up with the top level concept to combine, and the Steve Kramer and Robert Barron, and Robert Chamberlain, and all the staff writers and the script editors, and created this show. And why that ensemble creation doesn't quite fit with Macek's vision, because Macek is really focused on these supernatural moments, and he wants to recreate more of them.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting, and there are certain instances. Thinking like Vince Grant has some kind of, or possibly Gene Grant has some kind of, I think it was Vince in the 5th novel, that was very much a protoculture, driven kind of hallucination or vision. It's like, which is pretty wild. It seems that it started with Macek and continued with the.
And that particular instance was not, as far as I can recall, in this, but it certainly was inspired by the tone and the direction that Macek's going. Right. And I think it culminates in Aurora, who starts off as a baby, and every time she uses her psychic powers, she grows several years older.
Yeah.
And she starts off as a brief love interest for Scott. Well, Scott actually towards the end becomes a major figure, and it's very weird because Scott experiences things you'd think he'd mention. Like when Ariel turns into an energy being, he would be, he'd be all John McClane. How come the same shit happened to the same guy twice? My girlfriend turned into an energy being.
Yeah.
And so there is that aspect that's very strong, and in this, and that seems to be a direction that Carl's going. That he as a writer as a storyteller is very interested in.
Right. And it's the Sentinels being part of Robotech is, in my mind, I think you could agree that it's some retconning that has happened because of the Sentinels, as at least as Carl has intended. Jonathan Wolf. Let's bring in Jonathan Wolf. He does. Design wise, he looks very much the same age, or close to the same age, or around the same age, as he appeared in Sentinels. when we know of his appearances in the third generation arc. You know, he's you know, he looks pretty well for someone, you know, with a lot of battle experience and being an important figure. So you know, either he's doing some Hollywood level plastic surgery, or you know, there's
or you've got a short timeline, which is
short time span
of Macek solves that.
between things, or the vagaries of space folding. You
Right.
know,
Well, obviously, and when you get to the end of this, you get the impression there's a couple year gap from the end of the Sentinels to when they're returned to Earth.
Right.
So it seems to be implying that the Earth occupation is only 3 years in Macek's conception, and that there's actually a several year gap between the end of the Robotech Masters and the end of the arrival. But yeah, the Regis is talking about invading Earth like really early in the Sentinels, so I guess she must have had a 5 year time gap too. And again, that's one of the moments that Macek says too soon when the Regis has discovered Earth.
Macek or you mean?
Oh, sorry.
Jim.
Yeah, Jim says
Right.
of Macek too
Yeah.
soon because the Regis has discovered Earth and that the protoculture's already there.
Yeah.
And so she's on her way, and so
And the Sensor Nebula, anyone?
yeah, yeah, and at the end of the Sensor Nebula, and she's on Hayden 5 to control it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think Jim is, and that may be why he moved the start of it earlier to give himself a little more breathing room. The only gap in the middle of the story is when they're trapped on.
Also, anyway,
Praxis.
well, I guess that's interesting because a working theory of mine was that 2020 just sounds better. That's a better rating to. I don't know. Maybe there's too many twos in 2022. I don't know.
2020 kind of sucked.
2020 did kind of suck. Yeah, in real life. So, but anyway, also, I guess I brought the influences thing mainly because Carl, he just in the story Bible, he describes the big battle around Praxis. Should have a Kurosawa feel to it. Epic sequences intercut with personal battles. Jack distinguishes himself in battle alongside Rick and Jonathan. Karen gets rescued by a selfless Nea, you know, which is interesting because, yeah, I mean,
yeah, and they've been rivals up till this point.
novels certainly diverge from these kind of things as Carl had wanted.
We have Karen and Nea both fighting over Jack. Is this a harem anime now?
Yeah, I don't
we
know.
won't go
I
there.
can't answer that, but you know, Jack, you know, he's fighting alongside Rick. Which is interesting, and Jonathan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, he would have liked the opportunity to be in the Wolf Pack versus being in the GMU, according to the novels.
Mm-hmm.
Although he really wanted
there's
fly with a skull.
Yeah, and there's an exchange between Jack and Wolf about the Wolf Pack in the story Bible.
Right.
And I think it probably plays out much as it does in the novels.
Well, it's interesting because you know, he doesn't fight alongside Rick necessarily. Yeah, in the novels, and you know, but there is something of, you know, trying to keep in step with what Carl wanted, as for Rick to realize Jack is kind of reminds him of himself, and he wants to be there for him to sort of steer him a bit, guide him a bit, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, and which is something that was touched on in the end of the circle, you know. Maybe not like proactively touched on or explored, but it's at least there's something that is brought up in the end of the circle that, you know, Jack is assigned a mission because of Rick's interest in Jack and you know, in guiding him. So there's that, but you know, to fight alongside him, yeah, that's definitely something unique in the story Bible. To fight alongside both Rick and Jonathan,
mm-hmm.
that's definitely something that's unique to the Bible.
Right.
You know, and yes, and Nea, a selfless Nea rescuing Karen. You know, I feel that's very much a story Bible only thing.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I think Jonathan is a very poorly drawn character in this because he really only has one motivation, and that's get back to Min-May. And there's really nothing to him as a character, and I think I'm not a huge Jonathan Wolff fan. because I see Jonathan Wolff as the traitor that he is. But I know there are people who love Jonathan Wolff as a character, and
I like Jonathan Wolff as, I suppose as a character, but not as someone as like he's certainly no saint, and he's certainly. And I do have problems with certain episodes, certain really classic episodes of New Generation.
Well, it's just there's Eulogy is his one episode.
Yeah.
And I think people are very impressed with the backstory he's given, but he doesn't do a lot in that. And I don't think but nonetheless, he still has a motivation, and it's an interesting motivation. He is trying to sacrifice lives to save lives. And he's given up to the Invid, basically preserving the lives because you see, and they don't, the narrator doesn't really emphasize the visuals. But Soldier Town is about to be wiped out and everyone in it killed at the end of that episode because the Invid are surrounding it, right, preparing to attack because the deal is gone and Jonathan is gone. And so that he does have a motivation. He does have a backstory. In this treatment, all he cares about is Min-Mei, and he leaves to go to Earth because Edwards now has Min-Mei, and he refuses to fight against the Invid because he's really focused on Min-Mei and is now living with his sister's family, and his sister's family is killed by the Invid in their arrival.
Yeah,
and I have to wonder: did Macek forget Catherine and Johnny were his kids, or at some point did he change conception that Catherine and Johnny are his sister and his nephew? And if that's unclear, and so there's. So I don't think Wolff gets a fair treatment. The people who are hoping for Wolff to be developed as a character, I don't think get what they're hoping for in this story Bible.
Yeah, and I also find it interesting is that somehow all these scenes of Wolff having gone to Earth and trying to work with the Earth forces to build up some kind of defense, while the Sentinels War is taking place. Right. That's a very, very big difference between how things played out in the novels,
right?
And somehow it reminds me of the movie 300. The movie based on the graphic novel by Frank Miller. The graphic novel has once King Leonidas starts to march his troops out. It's we follow things along. With those Spartan soldiers, we don't really go back. We don't go back to what's happening in Sparta, but the movie chose to do that because, you don't have to be a Zack Snyder fan or not to appreciate what I'm trying the point I'm making. But yeah, it was directed by Zack
Snyder. Show them what they're fighting for.
Exactly. Like I told you, it's like before. It's like he wanted to show, that look, that what they're fighting for, for democracy, freedom, and stuff like that becomes something kind of abstract and just sort of something distant. It was what was Snyder was getting at, and then to show those kind of scenes in Sparta, that's what's happening in this other part of the story that's taking place at the same time, and other than being two places being explored at the same time may not be.
It might not be at the same time. It's not clear at all.
Yeah, you're right. But it's maybe, other than that, maybe not that much resemblance. But it's still there. Wolff is fighting for a certain preservation.
Yeah.
But I'm so used to just the Sentinel story by way of the novels and the comics by the wall trips. Just focusing on, intergalactic settings, rather than cutting between that and Earth. Yeah. Which I found
there isn't a lot of that. There's just a little bit of it towards the end. Okay. As they're cutting back and forth. It's after Jonathan leaves, and then there are just a few scenes cutting back between him and the 15th. And there are a couple things, and one of the things that it kind of was a little off-putting to me because it's like, he arrives on the ship. And now Dana's going to take the ship. And so these gigantic starships are kind of treated like a van that you can just hop into and drive away. And there are crews, and there are crews mentioned, like Lisa talks Edwards' flagship's crew into switching sides because they're convinced that because Edwards has the RAF convinced that the Sentinels are traitors. And as you'll recall, the Rick and Lisa and everybody who goes off with the Sentinels, they resign their commissions. And there actually is a mention where they return and they're back in REF uniforms. So it would be interesting, and I don't know if there's ever any art for it, but what uniforms or how do our characters dress once they resign their commission? Because at least Macek intended for them to no longer be in uniform. And so those daring do photos of Rick with his cape and his little pistol, that probably wouldn't have happened in the series because Rick would not have been in that uniform anymore. And I guess that does make sense to a certain extent. They are now mercenaries or terrorists, depending on your political point of view. And so, but yes, there is this, and they don't name themselves the Sentinels towards the very end, like when it's almost over, the war is the battle's almost over, and that's when they come up with the name Sentinels for who they are. And I don't know if you've ever seen the YouTube video Academy Award winning movie trailer, where there's a scene where the character is like, explicitly explaining the meaning of the story while casually dropping the movie title, and it goes the movie title. It's a great video. Look it up. But the other thing that, speaking of the ships, you've got these ships that Dana just hops on board and they drive it away, as if there's no crew maintaining it that have any say in the matter.
No crew, no higher
chain
ups
of command.
right. And which is actually
these are all SDFs.
Right. It's interesting that that's that Dana goes onto that ship and flies off, and which is something that's actually portrayed in Before the Infinite Storm. But Jim wrote that with she had to overcome actual obstacles, higher ups, and just be sneaky about it.
Right, because Jim knows better. And I think the same thing is when Britai decides that he's going to go off and investigate things, he chooses 40 of his best warriors. 40. Only 40. Grabs one of the new SDF ships they've built with the monopole ore and goes off. And it's like, again, it's like he goes to the rental car lot and picks up a van or, a small bus and just takes them away. And there's something very strange about how Macek is conceptualizing how these ships are working and how they're crewed. The other thing that struck me, and you can really see Jim Lucino bristling against this, is that apparently the entirety of the local group is within one solar system, or at least maybe a multi-star solar system like the Verse is in Firefly. And the way you see this is they're stuck on they're trapped on Praxis, which is abandoned, and the planet's beginning to break up, and so they find these anti-grav globes, and so they strap a bunch of anti-grav globes to because they said this armored alpha fighter, or really alpha plus beta, and they put like 5 people in it, and including Wolf, and to go back and warn the REF, and they are going to fly. They said if we can get it up into space from the ground using these globes, it'll have enough fuel to get all the way to the moon of Fantoma or Tyrol, and it's a fighter plane going between Earth and Mars is hard to conceive of, much less going between these different worlds that presumably are around different stars, although they never talk about the star systems they're in. And
or an alpha fighter trying to make it to wherever Admiral Hunter is.
Right. I like alpha fighter. I like to think Scott was rendezvousing with somebody because Scott's not an idiot.
Well, he's not a total one.
He's not totally an idiot.
Not totally.
He still doesn't know how to swim, although he does swim earlier. But that's a different discussion. And so this speaks to my criticism about Macek doesn't understand scale, and he's not the only one to do it. J.J. Abrams has no conception of the size of the universe, and you can see that in both the Star Trek reboot and Force Awakens. He thinks that planets are like the distance to the corner chemist, to put it in Douglas Adams terms, and so that was a really interesting thing. Although, and to pivot to some of the other things that I found that I thought were interesting was the question is what happened to Zentradi, and there are different schools among fandom about how many Zentradi there are left. I think you have a faction of fandom that keeps trying to bring the Zentradi back in even during the Invid occupation, although I think the Zentradi will have mostly been gone, and that's borne out by Scott talking about when they're saying, well, the Invid are not, and I think it's at the end of Sandstorms, the Invid aren't trying to kill us, they're just trying to find a way to survive, and Scott says, I don't care if the Invid survive or go the way of the Zentradi, which very clearly implies that the Zentradi are now extinct.
Right.
And that is actually supported in the story Bible. There's a line that refers to Britai, Exodor, and Myria as the last three of their kind.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's completely intended to be taken literally, because Britai does take 40 of his best warriors to go off and search for when he takes that ship. There's also never any indication that Britai returns to full size. And there are a few references in here where Exodor is still referred to as Honoris, which was an alter name that he was given at some point, and it gets scratched out and returned to Exodor by Jim Rosino. But later on in the manuscript, he's Exodor again.
Yeah.
And I think, if I remember correctly, and I think they may have talked about it somewhere in Art 3, that may have been code. They when they gave the information to the animators in Japan, they gave them code names for the characters who were from Macross, so that they wouldn't, be hidebound to their Macross portrayal.
Yeah.
Or maybe they wouldn't complain to Big West / Tatsunoko. I don't know. But and then there is this wonderful scene, and you wanted me to talk about this because you thought it was fascinating.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Where Myria and Edwards are fighting towards the very end, and Edwards thanks Myria for killing his arch rival, Roy Fokker. Now I think in the show, Myria is busy when Roy Fokker's actually shot down, and he's shot down by one of her squad mates.
Right.
But certainly has been a belief, I think, among fandom, and certainly Carl seems to have held that belief as well, that it was Myria that killed Fokker.
Right. But hey, purists, if you go by the animation, it's really not clear, right?
It's not, well, again, you'd have to go back and see, is Myria otherwise occupied? Is she somewhere else? If she's already on board the SDF-1 at that moment, which I'd have to check the footage.
Yeah, but she's...
If she can't be present at that moment, then she can't be the one to have done it.
She wants... Her prime objective really is to
find
that ace.
Yeah, find that ace. And of course, that's a separate discussion. That ace is probably Rick, because Chiron had never...
Chiron was... Yeah, he's talking about Rick.
Yeah.
He's talking about Rick.
The only guy that fought him to the standstill must be the true ace, and that's the irony of it.
But she finds another
ace. Yeah, and actually found two of them at the time. But
yeah, it's and so here's the thing. She's at least indirectly responsible.
She's definitely indirectly responsible
for Roy's death, and it's really interesting that this story Bible, just makes it
acknowledges that
makes it like a belief of now a known belief of Macek that, as you said, he thinks that Myria is the one who gave that shot that killed Roy. But what's interesting in novel 19 is Zentradi Rebellion. Rick, he does think about Myria's part in Roy's death. And he even wonders to himself, as the uprisings are going on and stuff, how he would feel if he somehow found out that Myria was the one who shot down Roy, and who shot Roy and had him killed eventually. So it's just he wonders what his feelings would be toward Myria, And I think that's just it's really interesting to see these different kinds of takes on this,
And at this point, there's a line where, and I forget the exact context, but it refers to Myria as the last of her race, which is not quite true because Exodor is still hanging out on Hayden 5 at this, or Hayden at this point. And so as we're winding towards the end, there are some differences. Aurora's role, and I don't remember the novel's role for Aurora, is pretty strongly expanded. She and Scott basically they
to me that's wild.
Scott finds what he thinks is Zor's tomb in the Royal Hall in Teresia. So they're trying to go there, but Edwards and and Tesla are using it as their base, so they get captured.
Yeah.
And Aurora starts basically, she starts transforming into an energy being. She keeps taunting Tesla with knowledge. Tesla's interesting because Macek is saying, Edward's only motivation is he wants to return to Earth and be dictator. That's the entirety of his character. He wants to force Minmay to marry him, and he wants to be dictator of Earth. Tesla wants to evolve into the ultimate being, and
Tesla is he's continually eating fruits
from different worlds
of flower life in the books,
and he grows an extra finger at one point.
Yeah, he gets more humanoid in his appearances.
Yes,
in his appearance, and over time, and then so there are ideas that are being adapted adapted by the novels and just fleshed out and executed a lot better than what the story of the Bible was.
And so there's an interesting, and you can comment on this again because I don't really remember it. So the way the war against the Invid ends is that Tesla and Edwards abandon Optera. Edwards has brought, and Tesla's basically tricked Edwards into bringing the brain, in Tyrol, the Invid hive brain, bringing it back to Optera. And so he does, and then you find out that the hive brain, and it makes you wonder why Tesla the Regent brought it along in the first place. The hive brain is the most evolved Invid of all. And it is the repository of all knowledge of the Invid. It's the true ruler of the Invid. And
really interesting difference between that and other stuff.
And the resolution to the show is that they realize that the children of Zor, the cha-cha little pink furry things, are the pollinators in this, are the pollinators of the flower of life. And so Rem and Cabell offer the brain, now the brain's been abandoned by Tesla and Edwards, they offer the brain, we can't undo what was done, but we can restore the flower of life to Optera, and Optera can become a garden again, and we'll bring the pollinators and we'll bring the storehouses of protoculture that they find, that Rem and Nia and I think Karen find. And they bring them back to Optera, and Optera starts over again. And then Optera becomes this cosmopolitan world of many races, including a now peaceful Invid. Which is weird because this is still before the Regis has arrived at Earth looking for the last protoculture. And so the Regis apparently has not gotten a memo somewhere. And so again, this runs into problems with Regis saying, I'll consume all the protoculture and I'll gather my people from across the cosmos. And the Invid on Optera are like, girl, we good.
Right. It's there's a reshuffle.
And I like the sentiment. I like the sentiment of that Rem, being the direct clone of Zor, who started this process, and who started the trauma of the Invid, is the one who restores the Invid back to their balance. And,
that
plays an act of contrition against this sin against them. And I think that's, I don't know that it works in the context of the storyline that we see, but I really like the sentiment that's being conveyed.
I mean, Rem does repopulate Optera with flowers of life
and the Praxians,
and
that happens here too as well, because the Praxians all leave Hayden 5 where they're kind of in a zoo and acting like gardeners and prisoners. But the Praxians basically moved to Optera and live among the Invid.
Yeah, exactly. Well, live among them, or at least live on the same planet.
No, it actually says that we see the new rebuilt Optera, and like humans and Praxians and Invid and other races are all mixing and mingling together.
It's a big difference because anyway, in a circle, Praxians only really are sharing this planet with the Invid in their current state post all the other events in the Robotech saga as told by the novels.
And that brings us to the question of what Robotech 3 Odyssey going to be, and that ties into the end of the circle. So I before we go there, I wanted to see, maybe we should wrap it up with that. But before we go there, do you have any other questions or sort of observations about the earlier stuff that's going on? Because I know you're more heavily read in the early stuff, and you probably read it in more detail than I have, and I've sort of gotten deeper in, but at a shallower reading level. Is there anything else you want to cover about the early stuff, and then we can talk about how this ends?
Well, anyway, I just want to bring up something about Hadon. because
I'm going there too.
yeah. Anyway, because when I managed to catch Jim on his way out of like I believe it was the music panel, just a few more words with our friend Jim, because having two panels to talk with him, still not enough.
Yeah.
And it's like not like I talked to him a lot anyway in general. So, but
Jim, the invitation to come from Annapolis to my house in Springfield stands. We'll make you a great dinner.
Right. Yeah. Invite me, man.
Yeah. It's only a 3.5 hour drive, dude.
Yeah. We consider that you made a 3.5 drive.
Right.
But
yeah. So what did he tell you about Hayden?
Yeah, he said that it was that came from Carl.
Mm-hmm.
It came from Carl because I honestly didn't know how Hayden exactly came about. But that's an idea that came from Carl, and that's in the story Bible. And then and there's just a few mentions of Hayden,
the deeper story that would be revealed in Robotech 3.
Yeah, and so it's like but Jim and Brian, they certainly developed this being Hayden substantially from those brief descriptions provided in Carl's manuscript here. And I noticed that this manuscript has explored thinking that there's a possible connection between Hayden and protoculture and the disciples of Zor. And
Zor himself.
Yeah. So it's just,
but it's only hinted at because he's leaving it for Robotech Art or Robotech 3, the Odyssey. He's not quite committing to any interpretation yet. Although I think there's an implication that because apparently there's a Tomb of Zor on Hayden as well.
Right. And anyway, Inner Circle was meant to be a novel based on Carl's ideas for Odyssey.
Right.
But anyway, so. But yeah, I mean, through the novel, through the Inner Circle novel, through all these different statues being built in honor of Hayden in the local worlds,
which there are no statues of Hayden mentioned in this.
Yeah. So there's some.
Yeah. So they're embellishing and they're building on those references to try and lay more of a groundwork than Macek has done.
Right. So Jim. When I mentioned that in an email to him, he said, Hayden morphed into a major player, in the novels, and he does have some kind of recollection of talking with Carl about where he and Brian were taking the character. So it's just or entity more than just a simple character, I think. But yeah, well, characters still works. It is a work of fiction. But anyway. So it's really interesting what they did with just a few words, in the story Bible about Hayden or Hayden as you prefer to pronounce him. But yeah, I mean, all the lots of fleshing out, and I think, and your view of the novels has
I'll get to that in a second, but I do want to add
have they changed it?
Yeah, I'll get to that in a second. I do want to add that on the drive over, I was listening to the RoboTalk podcast, and like I said, subscribe to it on YouTube. There are 3 episodes so far. They're all interviews that Tom Bateman has had with various cast members of Robotech, and they're great. They're great listening. So far, I've listened to 2 of them. I've listened to the Tony Oliver interview, and I've listened to the Eddie Frierson interview. And if you don't, Eddie Frierson was the voice of Lynn Kyle. Well, Eddie Frierson that's really interesting because Eddie Frierson has all sorts of great baseball stories, and I'm not a baseball guy, but I'm now interested in baseball. Right. Eddie Frierson coached Charlie Estevez, also known as Charlie Sheen, in high school baseball.
Wow.
And he tells stories. He tells stories about that.
Yeah.
But I believe it was the Eddie Frierson interview that he talks about, and it may have been Tony Oliver, but I think it was Eddie Frierson. He talks about a letter that Carl had sent everyone after the show had sort of stopped and the stories had fallen through, and he's taught in the letter, and he sent it to all the cast, and in the letter Carl describes his vision of how it would have ended, and it would have ended with the SDF-3 with Rick and Lisa and Min-Mei and Rem and all that crew going back into the distant past and
Right.
the child of Rem and Minmay becoming Zor, but Rem is also Zor, and there's some implications that that Hayden is Zor in some way.
A lot of people are Zor,
and a lot of people are Zor, and so the idea is that we go full circle, that this would be a cyclical thing. Now that has become cliched since then. We've had a whole bunch of stories. Battlestar Galactica is built around that. Tales from a Parallel Universe / Lex is built around that. And if you don't know what that is, it's total schlock. Go watch it. And so it may be cliched now, and I don't know how cliched it was at that point. But and I have to wonder if there are multiple tombs of Zor and there are multiple Zors in the past. Is Rem one of those Zors? Is Rem's and Minmay's child one of those Zors, the original Zor? And of course you got Zor Prime, so you have a Zor in each age. So that's I don't know. We'll never know that question. They're just interesting and tantalizing hints of where Carl wanted to go with this. And again, speaking as a purist, this isn't the Robotech that I know from the show or the Robotech I'm really want to engage with, but it's as a story and it's sort of unfolding. It's like an archaeological dig now. It's like I have this artifact, right. and I want to know about the culture that created that artifact. I want to know about the hand that wrote it. Yeah. And I want to know more. And even if I'm not all on board with that story, I want to know more about it. I want to know how this thing came to be and what was where it was going to go. Because his literal last page is, I'll read the last entry of this. The SDF-3 is being shaken up rather badly from the journey through hyperspace. Much of the ship is being torn apart internally, just as Lang suspected. Rick is trying to remain stoic. Lisa is looking after their child. Oh, Rick and Lisa finally have a kid. So for people like Prez and David Ferris who are like incensed that they never get to have a family, they do actually in this.
Well, they do, and novels use that.
Yep. Yeah. Lisa's looking after their child. Lang is totally nervous. Lang is nervous. They eventually come out of hyperspace, but they are not where they suspected themselves to be. At least they're alive, and there seems to be a habitable planet nearby. They turn the SDF-3 towards the planet and try to sort things out. The stage is set for Robotech 3, The Odyssey. And then the damn thing ends.
Yeah, that's because it's Robotech 2, The Sentinels, the story Bible.
and we go no further than that, except for that letter to the cast, that we know a little bit about who's going to go with that. Yeah. And some of his conversations that led to End of the Circle.
Yeah, and there were some things from what I've learned recently from
and Jim wrote entirely End of the Circle by himself, right?
No.
Because I thought Brian had largely passed.
Not that point.
Okay.
He had passed.
Or he was very ill at that point.
Yeah. It's my understanding. I think that's the case. But he was very ill during the novels. Yeah. Post novel 18. Yeah. So and
because I could swear Jim had said something to the effect at the con that he effectively wrote End of the Circle by himself.
Well, it's he interesting. Of what I know is, and what I've known from what his statements in interviews and stuff like that, and what he's what we talked about is that Jim wrote the first half of the End of the Circle.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Going by an outline that based on what Carl intended for
right.
For
okay.
the Odyssey.
Now I remember. Yes, that is what he said.
But Brian diverged a lot from that outline for the second half that he was responsible for that novel. But to both gentlemen's credit, I didn't know any better. I didn't know that when I first read the End of the Circle, I didn't know all this behind the scenes drama, and it was a big thing. It was a big deal between Jim and Brian, Jim was he was not pleased with that Brian went that way, but I didn't know any better in terms of and sometimes ignorance really is bliss because things were seamless in my mind.
They did a very good job of writing with one voice.
And there's plenty of mystery in the last few few lines or a couple pages of and a circle, but like certain works of fiction that may seem or appear open ended. If you have a lot of other stuff that works very well, you can like either overlook it or accept it. Like Akira is a good film, a good example. We talked about The Prisoner, a show that we've never watched, but we want to get to it.
Yeah.
It comes highly recommended, but there are things I think that preceded other shows that may not be as good because Prisoner, was the first to do it. Maybe it has that going for it, and maybe it's better in execution. Yeah. We talk pretty extensively about shows that we have not seen yet. But anyway, but execution is so important in terms of I feel like I mentioned this to Jim that there's a feeling of calm and peace or serenity like at the end of the circle. It's hard to explain. It's just it's pretty much ends with just Mime singing, and it's mysterious ending in which she's carrying the child of Zor. Mm-hmm. I don't understand how that's happening, but it's like, but there it goes, but she's just like by herself singing next to a piece of equipment that had gone missing for a great while.
Yes.
And so spoiler alert. No, but yeah. So it's just, so what can I say? I like Inner Circle a lot. And maybe the mystery is part of the reason, or just simply the execution, and certainly just things come together, and for all intents and purposes, a fairly happy ending for those who had survived the Robotech Wars. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, what you asked me, and we could have went on a diversion that sort of led into this. My answer is you asked me what I now think of the novels, having read the story Bible.
Right.
And I think the thing that I've said repeatedly on both panels and to you was that I think that it takes some of the heat off of Jim and Brian, that a lot of the things that I had issues with in the Sentinels, I know I cannot blame on them, because this is coming straight out of Carl's mouth, or Carl's pen,
right,
or typewriter, or some early almost unintelligible word processing software that he gets to at the very end.
Right.
That's just painful to look at. So this is coming out of Carl's mind, and so what the appreciation I get for the novels, and again, it's not the vision of Robotech that you could say that my vision of Robotech is historical and linear, and their vision of Robotech is circular and magical. And so, but within that, the confines of that to my taste, I feel like that this suggests that Jack McKinney in their two avatars was really writing the best possible Sentinels that they could, given the material that they were given to work with. And I think the perceived Carl's dispensation to do otherwise notwithstanding,
right,
the perceived obligation to stay true to what they felt was Carl's vision. And if you're coming into this story Bible and you feel an obligation to adapt Carl's story, regardless of how you feel it relates to the original series, then the what we got in the novels is the best possible adaptation of this deeply flawed but definitely interesting story.
Yeah, it's deeply flawed, definitely interesting. Who knows what a final version of the story of Bible would have been if they were able to get the funding they needed.
And then hire a team of writers.
Right.
Because again, Robotech was not written by Carl Macek. Robotech had a team of staff writers.
Right.
And it had a script editor and a story editor. And these people were as much part of what the TV show became, at least as much part of what the TV show became as Carl was. And then on top of that, Macross had a team of writers.
Yeah.
And Southern Cross had a team of writers. And Mospeada had a team of writers. And those guys are responsible for the events that you see day to day and that are being adapted freely into Robotech. So there are all these teams, and how the Sentinels would have turned out with a team behind it is really an open question. And it ultimately only got a team of 2 to do that adaptation.
I mean, it was what was possible. After the Sentinels animated series became it's in terms of like it's not getting developed in it. It's not. So it's gone on to other people to tell that story. And they were the first to tell it. And then Wall Trips with a couple of writers they worked with initially on the Sentinels comic began the adaptation, and they made some changes to the Sentinels story here and there. But their point of reference was, or at least their primary point of reference was the novels. Okay, the novels were the primary point of reference. They had access to script books, sure, but it's interesting what was going on since and how it's been, taken and then reinterpreted too. But my personal favorite interpretations of the story come in novel form and comic book form. There are flaws, here and there, and there are things that I think, can be dealt with similarly as a purist may deal with certain things that may seem to not make sense. I think could be applied to whatever flaws that might be in those works, the novels or the comics about the Sentinels, So
well, we're barreling towards midnight, and so do you have any wise words to wrap us up with? And I guess maybe have my final thoughts.
I don't know if they're wise. Maybe a few words. I can put together a few brain cells for a few words.
Right. It was a very long day at the con.
A very long day, but hey,
it was a good day. It was
a good day.
It was long.
Good day, and I'm just gonna thank Dennis and Tom Bayman, or Tom and Dennis Bayman,
for putting together Anime
LA RT40, and then it just, I guess, like Thanos, me, putting together East Coast panels, it was inevitable.
Exactly.
I didn't realize at the time. I mean, I just had done my part for Anime LA RT40, and then it's like, okay, hey, that was a chance of a lifetime. Honestly, I did, but over time it was suggested by Dennis and to put together East Coast shows, and then it's like, oh man, it's one of those things where, okay, well, you've been considering this idea, and then it's like, if I don't at least try, I will not be fine with myself. So
right.
It's at least I have at least tried, and I've had a couple shows, certainly not on the level of, the freaking glorious spectacle of RT40 / Anime LA, but I had Bill Spangler for one show, Garden State Anime Fest.
Mm-hmm.
I've got the illustrious Peter Walker, and a good friend of mine to another good friend of mine, Joe Wickfield.
That's a good guy. I like him.
Good guy, solid guy, and an artist who actually, I told him, hey, why don't you go to this show with me? He's been on the other side of a table of a booth, but he hasn't been in a while, and this was an opportunity. And hey, do some sketches, work on some sketches. He did some sketches. He brought them to one of the days we've had so far, and they're solid. They're solid. They're really good, and he tried his hand on Robotech characters. He's a fan of Robotech as well. Mm-hmm. So it's just all this stuff come together, and just big shout out, big thank you and to others who have participated in our shared experience. The friends I met in person.
Maybe the real Robotech continuity is the friends we met along the way.
the unassailable continuity of Robotech.
We met along the way.
We met along the way. Yes, we met and that we made. And anyway,
and that puts me in a perfect position to talk to say the final words that I've been thinking of.
Right.
And I'm reminded of the in universe, the diegetic article, the sort of the People magazine fluff piece about Rick and Lisa's wedding, and he's talked about the speeches that you wrote for them, and in those speeches they remember the people that were no longer there.
Yeah, it's part of the story, and I did try to inject some humor in there. I had fun with Max's speech,
but I think the where I'm getting at is I think that's the time where I do that as well.
Right.
And I was out of Robotech fandom for a very long time. I was done. I'd finished everything I needed to do, and I went on to develop other hobbies, which became semi-professions. And I have a whole other life that I live as well. You will see me walking around a skirt playing a very loud musical instrument as one of those part of that hobby. But a few years ago, I was drawn back into Robotech because we all have a mutual friend. I think many of the people who watch this video will know of Chris Meadows. And Chris Meadows was one of the OGs. And a few years ago, he was passed away in a auto pedestrian accident. It was a hit and run. Son of a bitch hit the guy on his poor guy on his bike. And I don't know if they ever caught him. And I popped by the Robotech discussion group to pay my respects because I knew who was one of the moderators there. And I got drawn back in. And and old enemies became friends. And not a moment too soon, because one of the old enemies and new friends was Prez Kennedy, and Prez Kennedy also passed away. I guess it's coming up on 2 years now, or is it? Yeah, it's I guess 2 years.
Right.
And Prez Kennedy passed away, and so
Yeah, it's I've had a significant personal loss too. Not anyone that among the fandom would know, but he was certainly a Robotech fan. It's just one of those things. And then there are
everyone involved in
Robotech pros who have passed away in recent times too. There's I forget the voice actor for Rico, but Tom Weiner was the voice actor for Jonathan Wolf. So he passed in 24, and then David Schweinkofer just recently had passed away, and
Carl himself not too long ago.
Yeah, in a way, Carl himself.
And so I think what I'm getting at, not to bring this in such a downer note, is that with all that in mind, and with it's kind of the memory of the people that didn't arrive here with us to this point, I want to say how incredibly privileged I feel. Even as the ultra purist, and I'll never live down that reputation. But even as someone who is on the philosophical opposite end of the spectrum of what this book represents, when it comes to my understanding of the show that we all and story that we all love. I won't even just refer to it as a show. It's a story that we all love. Yeah. How incredibly privileged I am to have this document in my hands. Be one of the first few people, other than the original writers like Jim and presumably the others who may have gotten copies, to have a chance to look at it and see what it means and see what it's telling us about how this story was being put together and this piece of history. And I feel privileged and I feel grateful to have had the opportunity to be here and to be here to talk about it with you on the 40th year of this show that means so much to us.
I can't put it any better than what you said, and because feeling is totally mutual. And I've said this before to Peter. It's like, man, just checking out I remember just checking out those using that group's posts back in the day. It's like, wow, you really mix it up here and there with Jim. It's like, but to credit both of you, it's like, whatever differences you had, you kept the dialogue going, and I think, well, Jimmy realized something that no one who simply visited those those posts online had known for themselves, because they hadn't met you, they hadn't met you or gotten to know you in any kind of way, and it's like, man, it's just another guy with a different opinion. That's all.
We're just all folk, as Mal said. We're just all folk.
Yeah. We're both Firefly and Serenity fans, so yeah. So just want.
I guess that's probably where you should wrap it up, right?
Yeah.
So
we're all just folk.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone who is seeing this in the future, and thanks for watching if you stuck to the very end.
Right.
And there are boring ramblings. So all right.
Yeah.
Are we done?
Yeah. What can I say? See you on the flip side.
All right. I'm pressing the stop button now.